The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for participating in this NISAC, the New York State Association of Counties webinar. This webinar is designed to provide the New York counties with an update on what the federal government has been focused on to help small businesses on Main Street and in York County, individuals, and of course, local governments and how we respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Stephen Aquario. I'm the Executive Director for your association in New York. And before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to introduce our presenters that will be joining us from the nation's capital. Today, we have the pleasure of having my colleague from the National Association of Counties, Mark Ritacco, the Deputy Director of Government Relations. We are very fortunate to have the National Association of Counties legislative team working on behalf of the New York counties and the counties across the country. Combined, they have decades of experience in the halls of our nation's capital, and Mr. Ritacco has personal experience working in the Congress, and we're very grateful that he joined NACo, and we're very grateful that he's here with us today. After the national presentation, we'll go to New York, and we'll go to Ryan Gregoire, the NISAC Legislative Director. He's going to cover the NISAC's engagement strategy with the federal representatives and some expectations for Stimulus 5. Following the presentations, we'll open up the webinar to questions for participants, and please know on your dashboard underneath the question screen, you can type in a question at any time during the presentation. Just type it right into on your right side of your screen, and the panelists will answer those questions as we go through the presentation or at the end, depending on the nature of the question. I really appreciate everyone joining us here today. We have a great cross-section of New York county officials on, from Long Island to Western New York, the North Country, the Southern Tier, and all places in between. This has been a very confusing process. At the same time, we have been battling on the front lines in public health, flattening the curve, saving individual lives, contact. We've also had to deal with a complete and total collapse of our economy and a concern about what's next. What's next for small business? What's next for our government? What's next for our people? What is the state of with respect to budgetary cuts? A lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, and a lot of eyes on Washington, D.C. to see how, when, will they come help the state and help the local governments. It's very important, the work of the Congress and the President, and we're very grateful, again, to have the National Association with us fighting so hard to ensure that counties get direct and flexible aid to them, and we just couldn't have been in this position without them. So very honored to have Mark, and very appreciative of the work of the National Association of Counties and its Executive Director, Matthew Chase. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Mr. Aquario. I appreciate the warm welcome, and I want to thank all the county officials listening right now. I'm truly grateful for the work you're doing. I have lots of family in New York, and I know the toll this crisis has placed on local governments. So thank you on behalf of myself and on behalf of NACo for the work you're doing. I joined NACo a few months ago after working in the Senate for about 13 years. So I appreciate the warm welcome from the county community. And one of the reasons I was excited to come to NACo was that I love the actual administration of government, and local government is where real governing happens. I didn't know at the time that my introduction to local government would come in this very stark way, but I am certainly have a tremendous new appreciation for your work. So thank you again, and it's an honor to be here. So I'm going to get right into how Congress has responded to this pandemic as a federal partner to counties. Back in March, the first bill that Congress passed in response to the coronavirus was called the Coronavirus Preparedness Response Supplemental Appropriations Act. And this bill, if you can remember back to March, was very much related to the public health response. When we knew the virus was a public health challenge, we didn't quite know what the economic impact would be yet. So it provided $2.2 billion in public health funding, $3 billion in research and development for vaccines and diagnostics, and that investment is, it seems like it's starting to pay dividends, so that was a good investment early on. And then an additional $3 billion in public health agencies. And this relatively small price tag compared to the price tags of future bills. If you recall, there was a fight between $1 billion and $8 billion at the time. And, little did we know that the cost of the crisis and the necessary response would balloon so much. So a couple weeks after that, Congress passed a second bill called the Families First Coronavirus Relief Fund. And this was a mix of both health and economic response to the virus. So it contained a provision that allowed for free testing for anyone who got a test, so their insurance wouldn't bill them, and then it also gave free testing to those on Medicare and Medicaid and veterans health insurance. It had $1 billion in assistance for nutrition programs. It very importantly increased the federal medical assistance percentage, which is called FMAP, which is really important to New York and counties all across the country. It had $1 billion in grants to assist states in processing UI benefits. And I think across the country, we've seen that the processing of UI benefits has been one of the most challenging aspects of responding to this pandemic. So, if we were to do it all again, perhaps this bill should have contained a little bit more in the UI space. And then finally, and it was important for counties, it also had a major overhaul of paid sick and family leave requirements. And the important part of that was that counties as employers were required to provide paid sick leave, but were not eligible for the tax credits at the end of the year that other businesses would receive to offset the cost of providing that sick leave. And so there's been individual bills introduced in Congress since then that would have fixed that for those local government employers, including counties. The next package, which I believe is in early April, was called the CARES Act. This is probably the most well-known of the three bills. It was the largest economic rescue package in U.S. history, totaling $2 trillion. It created, again, most importantly from the county perspective, created a $500 billion economic stabilization fund that authorized Treasury to purchase obligations and from local governments to cover the losses incurred as a result of COVID-19. This is called the MLF program. It allocated $100 billion in local hospitals. It delayed the statutory cuts to statutory DSH payments. And I think for all of our perspective, the other most important part of the CARES Act was that it created the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which was $150 billion in aid to states and local governments, including counties. And as I'm sure you all know, or we've talked about previously, counties were really engaged in Congress to make sure that this money was sent to local governments in a way that was fair and was true to the congressional intent. This fund, it's called CRF, again, the Coronavirus Relief Fund. It was helpful to our largest counties. The bill provided direct assistance to counties above 500,000, but as we all know, sitting here on the phone, certainly not all counties or even many counties are above that 500,000 person threshold. So only about 5% of counties nationwide received direct allocation from the Coronavirus Relief Fund. There was also, after the bill was passed, the Department of the Treasury, who was releasing the funds, interpreted the way to count population in a way that was detrimental to counties. What happened was the population of the largest city in the county would be reduced from the county's population in total, and the overall national effect of that was that counties nationwide received $5 billion less in funding. And so one of the other deficiencies of this bill, of this coronavirus relief fund, is that throughout the country, governors are not allocating the state portion of the coronavirus relief fund in a way that many local governments would say is quick enough. So the coronavirus relief fund is sort of a double-sided coin. In one side, for large counties and states, it was very good, but for smaller counties or counties with counties throughout the country that have a more contentious relationship with their governors, money, I think, has been slower. And again, importantly, I should have mentioned this at the outset, the coronavirus relief fund money can't be used for anything but direct COVID-19 expenses. So it couldn't be used for the lost revenue that you all are seeing right now. And that is a big drawback of the coronavirus relief fund. And we're about to talk about future efforts, and all of those future efforts recognize that lost revenue is something that we need to be talking about going forward. So that was the CARES Act. And then there was a fourth package, which some people called 3.5, which is kind of a political optics, but it was the fourth package. And that was primarily focused around the PPP Paycheck Protection Program. It had $75 billion in support for local hospitals, which was really beneficial for us and we liked. And it provided $25 billion in COVID-19 testing for rural areas. If I can have the next slide, please. So that brings us to today. And a couple weeks ago, so we're now considering the fifth package, which some people call the fourth package, which was also called CARES 2 for a while. But instead of all those confusing numbers, the House settled on calling the bill the HEROES Act for their latest effort. And this bill passed the House 2 Fridays ago. And this bill is good for counties. It provides a new state and local aid fund, which would flow directly from the U.S. Treasury to counties that could be used for COVID-19 related expenses, and it could also be used for lost revenue. It provides $500 billion for states, $375 billion for local governments, $250 billion for local governments divided equally between cities and counties, would be provided 30 days from enactment, and then another $125 billion for cities and counties 1 year after the bill is enacted. And so that would equal another $62.5 billion for counties in the out years, if you will. It was a very large bill. It was over 1,800 pages. They had a lot of county priorities that I'll talk about in a second. But again, perhaps the most important takeaway is that it will provide $187.5 billion in direct flexible funding to counties of all sizes based on population. Next slide, please. Here are some of the other things that was in the HEROES Act, which again passed only the House and not the Senate. I'll just rattle these off. They're on your screen, but a 14% in FMAP. So recall that the previous increase was 6%. This would be a 14%. Election assistance, that fix for counties as employers, that payroll tax credit issue I talked about before. The SALT deduction was in there. The removal of the 25% local match for FEMA funding, a $5 billion community block grant increase, homelessness assistance grants, food stamps, highways. It was really, it really had a lot of things that counties care about. And perhaps a legitimate criticism of this bill was that perhaps there's too much on top of the local aid that is so desperately needed and so urgently needed. And this bill's total price tag with all the things that are on your screen plus the local relief on the last slide was $3 trillion. And I think we should address that price tag. It's, from NACo's perspective, it's been difficult to kind of get our head around the legitimate concerns about debt and deficit. I know that that's something that we all care about, and certainly people on the phone care about. This is money that we don't necessarily have, and so these debt and deficit concerns, from NACo's perspective, we need to weigh the future debt and deficit concerns against the urgent needs of counties now. So when we say we support this bill, or we support this money, or we support these hundreds of billions of dollars, we do so with the understanding that it's a real tough situation to weigh what we view as urgent needs versus this really high price tag. And in terms of the urgent need, so the scale that we're considering, NACo research shows that counties across America are going to face at least a $144 billion shortfall, a fiscal impact of $144 billion through fiscal year 2021. And for New York, the percentage of that 144 is probably disproportionate. So when we're talking about a $150 billion bill split between, this is the CARES Act, $150 billion split between states, local governments, cities, and counties. If we're saying that the county impact is 144, 150 for everybody isn't going to get us anywhere near what we need to jumpstart our economic recovery. And if you look at the 2008 economic crisis, many people attribute the relatively slow recovery to the lack of fiscal assistance to state and local government. So, on one hand, it's these really high price tags of these bills, and on the other hand, it's our really solidly produced research that says this is what we need. So I just wanted to note that that's the juggling act we're trying to do when we advocate for these positions and how we think about these bills. Next slide, please. So in addition to the HEROES Act, so just to kind of level set, the HEROES Act passed the House. There's a $3 trillion price tag. It would be $350 billion to counties, to local governments. In the Senate, so that bill goes to the Senate now, where the Senate will either modify it, pass it, or start from scratch. And it appears likely that it will be a combination of modifying and starting from scratch. So in the face of that, many Republicans in the Senate, when the House passed the HEROES Act, said that the bill was dead on arrival. So in the face of that, there was a bipartisan group of senators and House members led by Representative Reed from New York and Representative King in the House, and then Senators Cassidy and Menendez in the Senate, to introduce a bill called the SMART Act. And NACo worked for weeks with all of those people I just mentioned to significantly improve the bill for counties while it was being drafted. And we'll talk more about the specifics of this bill in a minute, but the top line for the SMART Act is that it would be $500 billion in pandemic relief for state, tribal, and local governments. So of the $500 billion, 80 billion, so significantly less than HEROES, 80 billion of funding would be passed through the states through a somewhat complicated funding formula to counties. And so I'll give NACo's perspective on both of those bills in a moment, but if I could just have the next slide. When we are considering the SMART Act or the HEROES Act or any piece of legislation, what you're seeing now on the screen is the lens through which NACo is viewing each of these bills. So these are basically our principles. And these principles, again, are the lens of through which we're going to assess whether any proposal is good for counties. So the first principle is that counties of all sizes should receive direct and flexible fiscal relief. So flexible in this case means that the money should be able to be used for lost revenue, for COVID expenses, but the fifth principle will sort of put a guardrail around that flexibility. So the main point number one here is counties of all sizes and that the money should be flexible. We also, because of the unique county role in responding to the pandemic, we support a 50-50 at least split with other municipalities. So 50% for counties, 50% for cities. And the reason we support this particular way of allocating is not only because counties' role in responding to the pandemic is unique and robust, it's that it avoids the problem that we had with the CARES Act, where city populations were being deducted from county populations, and which resulted in counties actually losing money. So a completely split 50-50, two completely separate pots eliminates that problem. The 50% that goes to counties should be based on population. And the reason we support this is our research department, who I've mentioned before, ran hundreds of simulations and formulas and algorithms to figure out what would be the most fair way of apportioning funds. And population is the closest we can get to some sort of, broad nationwide allocation. Because remember, this is as much a math question as a political question. So if you did things like base it on amount of cases, for instance, that would tilt the money towards some places and not others. And then the amount of cases would be sort of a moment in time, and that moment in time could change based on when the bill gets passed. So a state that had lots of cases might now not have lots of cases. So population is we think, the fairest way to do this. And then to account for counties that have a really small population, there should be a minimum allocation per county. And the fifth is that there should be public accountability safeguards that still empower state and local officials to address the COVID-19 pandemic broadly. And this is really important because there are some there are some people who oppose local funding, saying that, oh, they're just going to use this to fill their pension shortfall or some other financial mismanagement. And NACo certainly doesn't support that. We support these guardrails because we know that counties are A, responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars, and B, have real legitimate public health expenses and lost revenue. So we're not afraid of putting reasonable guardrails around this money. So this is our framework. And so now let's talk about the two biggest bills that I've addressed already and comparing them using this framework as a guide. If I can have the next slide, thank you. So if we're comparing HEROES and SMART, the first principle is, do they have direct funding to counties of all sizes? Yes, short answer. The SMART Act, however, sends money through the states, and the states would be required to allocate funds to local governments within 15 days. And so this is, when I said the SMART Act was a little bit more complicated, this is one of the layers of complication that I should say is not ideal, but would still get money down to counties of all sizes. The second factor to consider is how much money would each of these bills provide to counties. And again, the HEROES would be 187.5, and the SMART Act would be 80 billion. And it would come in three tranches that I won't take too much time explaining, but the first tranche is based on population. The second tranche is based on the state's infection rate. So for those following along, I'm on the second box down in the SMART column. And the third will be based on lost revenue after December 31st, 2020. So the other complicating factor of the SMART Act is that we don't know how much each county is going to get until at least December 31st, when lost revenue is calculated. And in terms of how these formulas are arranged and how the money gets down to counties, I should have said earlier, but I'll say it now. The HEROES Act is certainly NACo's preferred allocation, and I dare say would be best for New York. The HEROES Act would. And the formula that's in the HEROES Act is taken almost wholesale from a bill that the members of the New York delegation led called the Direct Support for Communities Act. So that was a bill introduced by Senator Gillibrand, championed by Senator Schumer, introduced in the House by Congressman Delgado and Zeldin. And that bill, again called the Direct Support for Communities Act, was basically incorporated into HEROES and checked all of our NACo boxes. So because this is New York on the phone, I wanted to make sure that I noted that bill would be best, I think, for New York's counties. But again, the SMART Act is still a lot of money. So the other two things on the previous slide that I'll just mention quickly, you don't have to go back, is that both counties and cities would be split evenly with both bills, and that the county pot would be basically based on population, again with the SMART Act being a little bit more complicated. Other considerations for comparing these two bills is that both would essentially remove the 25% local match for FEMA, and it seems like FEMA is going to do that administratively any day now. So that's a bit of a moot point. And then the area of the bill called maintenance of effort, the HEROES Act is silent on, but the SMART Act, which I think would be beneficial for a state like New York, would basically say that states can't cut money from the state to counties based on the fact that counties got money from the federal government, and that these cuts need to be basically thoughtful and based on need, and the state legislature would be able to disapprove of those cuts. Next slide, please. So the other, the last three boxes that we're looking to check here is that can both be used for lost revenue? Yes. How to calculate lost revenue is different in both bills. The SMART Act places a little bit more of a restriction on lost revenue, and it requires sort of more robust calculation on what that lost revenue would be before counties can access the money. And I can obviously take questions on all of this afterwards. I'm just trying to get through this chart, and you all can read along as well. But and then the final thing, those guardrails. The HEROES Act has, I would say, just to be fair to it, sort of fewer guardrails than the SMART Act, and the SMART Act specifically mentions not being able to fund pensions as one of those specific ineligible uses of funding. Next slide, please. So everything I basically talked about is on NACo's coronavirus relief page. I would encourage you to go there. It has analysis of all these bills. It has advocacy tools and everything you would ever want to know about the federal response to COVID-19. Next slide. And so that brings us to right now. It's where are we going from now? How can we either encourage the Senate to pass the HEROES Act, encourage the Senate to pass the SMART Act, which again is bipartisan. So obviously bipartisan bills have more of a chance to pass than largely partisan bills, which is what the HEROES Act was. So as of today, this morning, Leader McConnell, who, as you know, is in charge of the Senate, has mentioned that state and local aid will likely be part of the next package. He's gotten to this position slowly over the course of a couple of weeks, but he was in Kentucky yesterday basically saying that state and local aid will be a part of this, and it becomes a question of how much and what the allocation mechanism will be and all of that. So in terms of engaging with Congress, we need to convince Leader McConnell and Senate Republicans both that state and local aid is necessary, and it seems like we've gotten pretty far on that front, but also that the method of allocation is very important. As I mentioned earlier, and a treasury interpretation costs counties $5 billion. So you can imagine the way you slightly change a formula or slightly change an allocation can be billions and billions of dollars that are desperately needed for local governments that don't get there based on how the bill is written. So we need to engage on those two fronts, both the macro being please pass local aid and the details, how that local aid gets pushed down to local governments. The Senate is key because the House already passed the bill, so the Senate will certainly be the next to act. But if the Senate passes a completely new bill, as you all know, that bill would have to go back to the House. So we need to stay engaged in the House to, again, on those two big points. One, that counties desperately need local aid, and two, here are some ways we think that counties should get that aid, and that's based on population, directly, should be counties of all sizes, lost revenue should be eligible. So all those principles are also important in advocating for this position to House members. And, I'll just conclude before questions by saying that the New York delegation has been the leaders nationwide on this issue. All of these bills that I mentioned are basically New York bills. And in a bipartisan way, Representative King, Reed, Zeldin, Delgado, Gillibrand, I'm sure I'm missing some, but Schumer, have all been super engaged in this. So thank you to New York's congressional delegation, and thank you to Steve for keeping the pressure up. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I'm going to just go over a couple things here from the New York County perspective, and then I'll go ahead and administer the Q&A here. So good morning, everyone. My name is Ryan Gregoire. I'm the Legislative Director with your association, the New York State Association of Counties. So just real quick, I know Mark touched base on some of these bills. I wanted to go over in real specific terms for New York State. The first package that Mark talked about, Phase 1, the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act, was signed into law on March 6th. This was a $7.8 billion package, and you can see here on the slide how it parcels out. This bill was signed on March 6th. And again, once we post all these slides, there's direct hyperlinks in here. So if you are interested in reading through the bills in detail, you can either go to NACo's website, as Mark just said, or you can click on these links. Next slide, please. Okay, Phase 2 was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And this is really where NISAC and NACo, and we are incredibly grateful for the partnership with Deborah Cox at the National Association, Mark, who's on the line with us today, and Executive Director Matt Chase. They were instrumental in helping us work with our delegation to increase the EFMAP assistance, and that's the federal Medicaid assistance percentage, which was increased by 6.2%. So this was a direct benefit to New York State and the counties because, as you all know, we share in the in paying and footing the bill for Medicaid. So this was a major win for counties, and I would be remiss if I didn't thank Senator Schumer for all of his work in getting this across the finish line. And that bill was signed on March 18th, so just a week or so after. Next slide, please. Okay, Phase 3, this was the CARES Act. This was the largest package to date as far as COVID relief. This included the supplemental benefits for unemployment insurance, the $377 billion that Mark mentioned for the PPP and EIDA programs, which a lot of your counties have taken advantage of and really helped to connect local businesses to some of those funds. And then it also included the Coronavirus Relief Fund for counties with a population greater than 500,000. Next slide. Okay, Phase 3.5. This was the Paycheck Protection Program and Healthcare Enhancement Act, signed into law on April 24th. This included an additional $75 billion for hospitals on top of the $100 billion in the CARES Act. So hospitals received a total of $175 billion. I know there was some confusion on our daily leaders calls on Thursday night, so I just wanted to clear that up for everyone. It also included a large increase in the PPP program. We were working at this point in the game in mid to late April. We were working aggressively with NACo and our congressional delegation to really spearhead and try and get local assistance included in this phase 3.5 or 4.0, the fourth bill. At the end of the day, it ended up being a much more stripped down version than what we were hoping for, but we've continued to work and build up quite a bit of momentum on this front. Next slide, please. So phase 4, there's really 3 bills, as Mark talked about, and compared the HEROES Act to the SMART Act. And all of these bills are championed by New York State members. And I want to take a moment just to talk about how our delegation has been extremely engaged with NISAC and with NACo. Congressman Delgado from the Mid-Hudson Valley region and Congressman Zeldin from Long Island, one's a Democrat, one's a Republican, have co-sponsored in the House the Direct Support for Communities Act, which was spearheaded by Senator Gillibrand and has the backing and support of Senator Schumer. This formula is exactly what New York State counties and NACo wants. It's the formula to share direct, unrestricted aid to counties by population. This is exactly what we want. And that formula was included in the HEROES Act, which was sponsored by Chairwoman Nita Lowy from the downstate region as well in New York State. She's the chair of the House Appropriations Committee with Speaker Pelosi. And the HEROES Act, as Mark was alluding to, has a lot of key priorities in it for New York State counties. It includes a 14% FMAP increase. This is what the governor has been speaking about on his daily briefing calls. He's been asking for an FMAP increase. It includes a Restore the T-Band Act, and this is a NISAC and New York City priority. We've been asking for this bill to be passed and included as rider legislation in prior bills for over a year now. It removes the FEMA local match requirement. This was an issue that the governor and that our counties have been talking about. Counties have been delaying tapping into that FEMA local match or that FEMA local fund because of this match requirement. So this legislation would remove that. And then, of course, it includes $187.5 billion for counties. Unrestricted aid, it's exactly what we were looking for. So, but it's declared dead on arrival in the Senate, and the president has threatened to veto because it's seen as a partisan bill. But I just want to talk real quick about some of the members in the New York delegation, and I have some exciting news to share with everyone today. I just heard before the webinar began from Congressman Brindisi's office. He represents Madison County, Cortland County, Broome County, some of the central New York and southern tier counties, that he is joining as a co-sponsor for the Direct Support for Communities Act. So it's picking up more steam. It's picking up more New York delegation members, which is really good to see. So aside from Delgado and Zeldin and Brindisi on the Direct Support for Communities Act, Congresswoman Stefanik in the North Country has been urging the White House to support direct unrestricted aid for counties. Congressman Reed has sponsored with Congressman Gottheimer from New Jersey the SMART Act, which is a bipartisan bill, as Mark was talking about. Congressman Tonko in the Capital District and Congressman Higgins in Erie County and Niagara County have been urging House leadership and Speaker Pelosi to really push and carry this message of direct support for counties. And then, of course, Representative Lowy introducing the HEROES Act. Yesterday, we had a phone call with Congressman Swazi from Nassau and Suffolk County, and Congressman Reed from the Southern Tier. These are two members who really worked with Congressman Zeldin to sponsor a full delegation bipartisan letter to House leadership urging unrestricted direct support for counties and local governments. Every single member of the New York delegation, all New York City members, everyone upstate, everyone on Long Island signed on to this letter. So it's really exciting to state that. You know, I can't stress enough how much support we have from our delegation. They are the leaders on this front, and we're grateful for that partnership. Next slide, please. The SMART Act, I'm not gonna run through this. Mark has already touched on these details, but I wanted to mention that, you know, some of the specific details for New York State are here. I folded that out in the text. Next slide. So then what is our messaging? What's the NISAC and NACo messaging? And it really comes down to providing direct, unrestricted aid to county governments to be shared by population. I just talked about this. This is what the Direct Support for Communities Act does. This is what we're supporting. So what we're asking our members to do, what we're asking all county officials across the country to do, is engage with your member of Congress. Specifically tell that local story. What kind of services will be impacted without this revenue? How does it directly affect your constituents? And give hyper-local examples. For example, if your rail trail has to be closed because you have to furlough parks employees or DPW because they can't repave the path, and that closes out the trail to 7,500 annual visitors, and 400 county employees are going to be laid off, which includes public health nurses or whatever your case may be specific. The members of Congress will answer your phone as an elected official, as a leader at the county level. They want to hear from you, and they want those hyper-local examples. So I think with that, that concludes my presentation. We're going to now switch gears and open this up to some questions. So again, I want to thank NACo for joining us. And at this time, we'll open it up for some questions here. So Mark, the first question that's come in, I think we can both answer this, but I'll defer to you. And this, I believe, has to do with the HEROES Act. If the HEROES Act does not pass the Senate, then there will be no local relief. If they adjourn for the summer without addressing this bill, counties will be put in great hardship, especially small counties in rural areas. There is already food scarcity issues, high unemployment compounding financial security. So Mark, you had touched on the HEROES Act and this being a relatively partisan piece of legislation. Do you want to speak to what you're hearing across the nation on some of the concerns that other rural counties are raising?
Yeah, thanks for that question. In rural counties, as we've seen, not only New York or across the country are facing those acute issues like food security, and the other economic challenges that again are more acute. So let me first talk about the timing. Everything we're hearing from the Senate is that Leader McConnell is not in a quote unquote rush to do this, which is disheartening because the needs are so urgent, especially in our rural counties. And as you all know, of course, the services that we provide need to be, fully funded. These are essential services like 911, paramedics, hospitals, and that sort of thing. So we certainly can't wait. There is a July 4th recess, which would be in about 5 weeks or about 6 weeks. That could be a sort of triggering mechanism to bring everybody to the table to pass a bill. There's also the expiration of the small business lending program, the PPP program that Republicans in the Senate like a lot, as do many Democrats, obviously. But the expiration of that program would bring, I think, Leader McConnell to the table, and that funding was re-upped during the 3.5 package, as I mentioned earlier, and that funding is being spent more slowly than the first round. So that money could last, the PPP money, the small business money, could last well into the summer. So that trigger, if you will, to bring people to the table may not exist until later in the summer. And I think there's also some political considerations, some sort of 3D chess that I won't even, pretend to speculate on, that it might be politically advantageous to one group or the other to wait to do this package. I think Republicans are keen to wait, and Democrats, seeing the devastation to local governments across the country, are saying that we can't wait. And that might be a little bit too simplistic or crass, and no one's saying it out loud, but again, having spent so much time in the Senate, I can imagine that those are the types of conversations that are happening.
Great, thanks, Mark. The next question is, should we be lobbying for the HEROES Act, or should we be advocating for a more reasonable level of federal assistance to local government? On this question, I would say from the NISAC perspective, we're really lobbying hard on the Direct Support for Communities Act, which is the funding formula. We're focused on that formula to provide counties with unrestricted assistance that can be used for revenue replacement or for coronavirus expense. Mark, did you have anything else you wanted to add on that point?
Yeah, I think that's the right way to thread the needle. The HEROES Act, as we've all sort of assessed and analyzed here, is better for counties, is better for New York County specifically, but the method in the Direct Support for Communities Act, if it were transposed on any bill, would be at most ideal.
Great. The next two questions I'm going to take, I'm going to combine them. So the first part being, the question is, for the SMART Act, the governor could still hold up delivery of the funds going to counties. And the second part is it possible for the state to withhold funding due to the Medicaid, Medicare funds that the state is saying it has a shortfall for? So these are two really, I think, maybe New York-centric issues, Mark. I don't know. You can speak from the national perspective. I'll kind of talk real quick from my angle here in New York. The short answer to both of these questions is yes, because the funds in the SMART Act wouldn't be distributed directly to counties through the Treasury. They, as Mark said, they go to the state first and then come down to the counties. The governor could still propose cuts to his budget, which would impact local aid to counties, and that might include some withholding or at least partial delay in some of the other federal funds that has been appropriated in prior bills, specifically the FMAP increase. So what I would say on that is it's yet to be determined what the governor is going to be doing. We're going to talk about this shortly here, but the governor has specifically stated that he's waiting for federal action, and this is as recent as yesterday's press conference at the National Press Club after meeting with President Trump. The governor has stated repeatedly that he is not going to propose his cuts until he sees what federal action happens, and he said that for the last week. So I think we're still in a little bit of a wait and see mode as far as what kind of cuts might come to counties depending on federal action. But from your perspective, Mark, are other counties concerned with their governors withholding aid during this fiscal year if the state is in a particular crunch? without federal aid?
Yeah, and I want to separate the ability of the governor to withhold into sort of two buckets, as you did, Ryan, which I thought was accurate. The SMART Act would require the governor to pass the appropriated funds down to local governments within 15 days. That's a rock solid obligation, and it was actually a piece of the bill that NACo inserted. So there's no wiggle room in the actual allocation of the funds in the SMART Act. The original, maybe I'm speaking out of school here, but the original draft said something like within some reasonable time frame, and we tighten that up to 15 days. However, the withholding could come, as Ryan said, in the state budgeting process, and that's why the SMART Act has a somewhat complicated mechanism and language that was inserted, I think, by members of the New York delegation that would essentially make any local cuts required to be justified before they happen.
Great. Okay, the next question is, given the reality of partisanship in Washington, is it realistic to keep supporting HEROES Act versus the other SMART Act, which has already garnered more bipartisan support and has not yet been rejected by the White House?
Short answer, yes. Long answer is that the HEROES Act, the portion of the HEROES Act just for local governments, so not everything else, that significantly raised the overall price tag of the HEROES Act, is still, I think, viable. Obviously, or maybe not obviously, but it's my estimation that the only thing that's going to pass the Senate is bipartisan. So, the two paths there are attempting to make the HEROES, the formula in HEROES more bipartisan, which the Direct Support for Communities Act does, or rallying around the SMART Act with some perhaps some modifications that make it better for counties. But yes, the HEROES Act is seen as very partisan, but I don't think that the local aid portion of the HEROES Act is the partisan part of it, if that makes any sense.
Great, thanks, Mark. The next question comes from Genesee County. Based on actions by the governor in New York State with the first federal stimulus acts, are we in dispute with our governor on federal stimulus 4? What other states are in similar fiscal COVID-19 status as New York? I'll take this first and then kick it to Mark on that second part of the question. We are not in conflict with the governor on federal stimulus 4 action. He, although he's been a little more direct or partisan, I guess, on the two proposals, he is supporting the HEROES Act over the SMART Act. NISAC's position continues to remain the Direct Support for Communities Act, which is that funding formula that we've been talking about. At the end of the day, we are incredibly grateful for both Congressman Reed introducing the SMART Act. And I should note that NACo and NISAC worked really hard with Congressman Reed, and he was very successful in negotiating with Senator Cassidy and Senator Menendez to reform their initial proposal and amend their bill to address some of the issues that we had all raised. So that bill is a big improvement over where it was. It's relatively beneficial for New York State because, as Mark was alluding to, with the complexity of the formula and the way that the money would be distributed to counties, there's an infection rate calculation built into the formula. So because New York State has a relatively high infection rate as compared to other states, we would benefit more so than maybe some states that don't have such a high infection rate although I won't get into the details, but there is funding floors for those states. So they would receive a minimum benefit of, I think it's $2 billion. But we are in relative lockstep with the governor. And from our perspective here, we want to partner with the governor. We recognize that the state is facing a severe financial situation right now. And we know that without federal stimulus aid for both the state and counties, that the potential cuts are inevitable. So we need the state to receive funding from Washington as well. But on that second portion of the question, what other states are in similar fiscal COVID-19 status as New York? And are there other states in disputes, or are there other county associations or counties in dispute with their governors? I'll let Mark opine on that.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And I think taking a giant step back, the main difference between HEROES and SMART, just again from the 30,000 foot approach, is that, and perhaps this is why SMART is the acronym, is that instead of HEROES, which kind of shotgun blasted money out into America based largely only on population, the SMART Act attempts to allocate money based on need. So infection rate, lost revenue, there's metrics that there's metrics built into the formula that respond to the fact that some states were hit harder than others. However, in New York's case, unfortunately, both of those allocations would put New York in a relatively good position, because unfortunately there is a high infection rate, there is a lot of lost revenue. So we're not talking about a state like, I'm just going to pick a random one here, North Dakota, where the infection rate number might not be as high, the lost revenue number might not be as high, although in North Dakota they have tremendous oil and gas lost revenue. So New York is unique in that way, that kind of either way you slice it, New York will do better than your average state. But the Direct Support for Communities Act and the HEROES Act is the best way to do it. And then the second part of that question is, are other states in conflict with their governor? Is not really for me to say, but I will say, though, that a correlated question to that is, what are other states doing relative to the CARES Act money? So going back to the CARES Act, there's a state portion of the CARES Act that could be sent to local governments that is basically under the governor's discretion. In New York's committed percentage of state money going to local governments is basically 30%. And that is in the upper, I would say, 85th percentile of all states. So some states governors are sharing $0 with local governments, and some are sharing the 45% threshold that was built into the bill. Like Minnesota, for instance, and Maryland are two states that are sharing 45% of the state's money with local governments. New York is 30%, which is high compared to other states. So to me, that's sort of a correlated a corollary, I guess, for how well the locals and governors are working together to get money down to local governments.
Great. And then Mark, it looks like we have one question left, and we have, we'll take this last question and then we'll conclude the webinar. Can you please speak to the 25% local match to the FEMA Public Assistance Program? Is it being relaxed by FEMA regardless of what happens with the SMART and HEROES Act? Where does that stand?
Yeah, so less clear than we would like by this point in the week, but what's today, Thursday? On Tuesday, the White House basically announced that the 25% match would be relaxed. So that would happen administratively. It wouldn't matter what Congress did. they basically said this is happening. And as you all in New York know, there have been other instances where it seemed like this is inevitable, but hasn't yet happened. So we're essentially waiting for word on this, and maybe Ryan, you know better than me in the last hour or overnight whether something official came down. But it's certainly our understanding that regardless of what Congress does, the 25% match will be eliminated.
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet either, Mark. It is a little frustrating that it hasn't been crystal clear yet, but of course, for everyone on the line, as soon as we do get some guidance from FEMA or from the Fed, and we'll continue to work with NACo, I'll continue to work with Mark on this. As soon as we have that information, we will, of course, share it with everyone. We'll send out an action or a news alert to our county so everybody's aware of that. So with that, again, I just want to really thank Mark Ritacco from the National Association of Counties. Mark has had years of experience working in the halls of the Senate and negotiating legislation, and we're very grateful for having him on our side. And I can't thank you and Deborah and your entire team, Mark, really, for staying in constant contact with us throughout all hours of the night and day. We really appreciate it. And of course, to all of our members on the phone, I mean, without you engaging your delegation, we would not have this wide bipartisan support from all corners of the state really pushing the federal government to act and House and Senate leadership to act. So I can't thank you enough. We got to keep the pressure up, as Mark stated earlier. We need you to keep telling those hyper local stories, really tailor it to your community. I know a lot of you've been doing that, and I know that our delegation understands the desperate need and plea from county governments right now. Just keep the pressure up. And if you have any friends in other states who are county officials, feel free to give them a call and get them engaged with their members of Congress as well. So with that, Mark, I'll just give it to you if you have any last words, but thank you again for joining us.
No last words except to say thank you. It's been an honor to talk to you. Like I said, I have lots of family in New York, and I just really appreciate all the work that you all are doing. I appreciate the partnership with you, Ryan, and please reach out to us anytime.
Okay, thanks everyone. That will conclude today's webinar.